Happy holidays from One Mind Syndicate. I am your host Gershwan, and today we're going to talk about the Necrons. I'm going to continue Tausember, so if you're a Tau player looking forward to those Tau lore videos, don't worry, they're still coming. I'm working on a script right now that should be out either Thursday or Friday, but I wanted to create this longer lore video for you guys because I've been getting a lot of messages and comments saying that you guys listen to us while you paint, which is awesome because you get to work on your pile of shame, and it seems like a lot of you guys are going on vacation, so you guys need longer videos to actually sit there and put in work. So I thought maybe creating entire compilation videos will be helpful for you guys because it gives you more content to listen to, and a lot of these videos are from lower performing stories, so they're stories that were shorter to begin with, so YouTube really didn't promote them, so it gets more people to listen to these awesome lore stories, and it also gives me a small little break because, like I told you guys in the previous 40 Facts video, this month is really busy for me with like work, life, and just everything. So sit back, enjoy the Necron lore, and hopefully you get some work done. So let's get into 40 Facts and lore on the Orcs versus the Necrons. At first, it's easy to assume that the primitive Orcs wouldn't stand a chance against the Necron race. After all, the Orcs' preferred weapon of choice is usually a basic chopper, while the Necrons have gauze weaponry that could de-atomize a target from a distance. And while the Necron lords might view the greenskins as simple vermin, only a foolish overlord would underestimate the savagery of an Orc walk. If a tomb world is not large enough or not fully awakened, the rampaging Orcs would easily overwhelm the Necron lair. And a tomb complex is an amazing prize for an Orc, with technology that can defy the laws of physics and enough resources to triple the size of a warboss's walker army. The Necron's home is a prized jewel for the greenskins. Such was the motivating factor for the Orc warboss Skullcrack, who led a great walk into the desert tomb world of Fortress, on rumors that the planet was home to an ancient alien weaponry. After weeks of searching, all that the Orcs had discovered was that Fortress's seas were highly acidic and that its omnipresent sand got everywhere. Yet in truth, Fortress was neither a lifeless nor an uninhabited world, as Skullcrack discovered when the first wave of Necron warriors emerged from the planet's blood-red seas. Brackish water streamed from the living metal bodies. The soulless androids strode across the obsidian sand, each marching in perfect unison with each other, except for those few circuit misfires causing involuntary twitches and stumbles. As quickly as he could, the Orc warboss Skullcrack bellowed out his orders and the Orcs prepared for battle. The Necron phalanx came to an abrupt halt, they swung their gauze flare to bear, and the killing began. The first volley of energy cut deep into the disordered Orcs. Skullcrack, being somewhat quicker-witted than his followers, survived by hoisting up one of the lads off his feet and using him as cover. As a second torrent of energy crackled into the greenskins, Skullcrack threw aside his shield and roared at his boys once more. This time the call of the Wog was taken up across the length and breadth of the shoreline. Choppas flailing, the Orcs hurled themselves into the storm of emerald energies. Such a charge would have been sufficient to freeze the blood of any mortal foe, but the Necrons were not so easily shaken as creatures of flesh. 3 more volleys did the mechanical warriors fire, and dozens of greenskins fell to the black sand, but then the Orcs were upon them. Skullcrack hurled himself into the Necron ranks, swinging his massive war axe in a succession of brutal alley-crunching arcs that smashed undying heads from their shoulders, crushed rib cages, and shattered limbs. Within moments, the Orc warboss stood alone in a sea of twisted metal. He roared his dominance over the foe. Yet Skullcrack's claim to victory was premature. Even as the last Necron fell, the regeneration circuits of the first triggered, drawing upon hidden power reserves into the limbs and returning the warriors to full function. Even before Skullcrack's shout had finished echoing off the cliff, the Orc warboss found himself surrounded once again by the reanimated forms of those he had just hacked apart only moments before. Such was the scene all across the shore. Again and again, the Orcs' ferocity bore Necron warriors to the ground, but again and again the fallen dragged themselves back up into the fight. Decapitated heads were reclaimed by grasping hands, and severed arms scrambled across the sand in search for sundered necrodermis bodies. As the momentum of the Orc charge faded, the Necrons began to hold their own in the bitter battle. Still acting in unison, the Necron warriors hacked at the Orcs with heavy-bladed bayonets, and unlike their opponents, the greenskins that were struck down did not rise again. Only near Skullcrack was the fight still in the Orcs' favor, for the warboss had taken to smashing his opponent into as many and as small pieces as possible to delay the inevitable reassembly. So lost was he in the joy of battle that Skullcrack didn't notice the swiftly rising tide until the waters were lapping at his feet. The dynamic of the battle had changed as the sea rose up to the beach to swallow the sands. For the first time since the fight had begun, downed Necrons were failing to regenerate, as vital components were swept out into the seething waters of the bay. Yet the rising tide also sucked at the Orcs' feet, making their footing treacherous. Worse still, those Necrons that managed to self-repair did so hidden beneath the waves, and many an Orc were dragged beneath the surface by grasping mechanical hands. Bellowing at his lads to follow, the war boss ran back to the beach as swiftly as the drag of water about his leg would allow him. There, under the shadow of the cliff face, the Orcs prepared to make their stand. The waters below were quieter now. Only a handful of Necrons were visible above the water, and then suddenly they were sucked beneath the surface. The greenskins let out a cheer, but the noise swiftly died away, as out in the bay the waters parted once more and a slab-sided monolith heaved its way to the surface. Gunfire scattering off its armored flank, the war machine glided slowly towards Skullcrack and his remaining boys. There was an ear-splitting whine. The crystal atop the monolith glowed a piercing white, and then all that was left of the Orcs was a smoldering pile of ash. Far beneath the surface of the bay in a vaulted stone chamber, two enthroned Necron nobles watched the holographic reaction of Skullcrack's demise. Rising, one banished the hologram with a dissatisfied wave of his metallic hand.
Combat efficiency remains at 70% of acceptable parameters. Further data is necessary to complete the required optimization.
Indeed, replied the other, also rising.
Recommend activation of Mind Shackle Scarabs XD11101. Humans will provide a suitable comparator.
The first Necron nodded to indicate his agreement and issued the necessary command.
It is done. If the subject performs as expected, we have 3 solar months to prepare.
Shortly thereafter, 3 sectors away, Tech Priest Drudak began preparation to investigate a report cache of xenotechnology. It was located in an out-of-the-way desert world known as Fortress. Now we can gather from this information that the Necrons were setting up the Orcs. They knew that the Orcs were coming and they wanted to test out new weapons on the Greenskins. However, the same cannot be said for another notable encounter between the Necrons and the Orcs. When attempting to loot the ancient treasures of the Necron tomb world, Death Skull warlord Zork triggered a planetary reanimation protocol. Canoptic constructs by the thousands surrounded the Greenskin invaders, but far from being intimidated, the Death Skulls were delighted. They scavenged and stole at will. The Orcs cobbled together hordes of cyborgs, Morkanauts, and ever more improbable super weapons. While using a hijacked Necron Dolmen Gate, they ferried in waves upon waves of reinforcements. By the time the Tomb World's overlord Thamtek the Magnificent awakened to take command of his legions, he did so at the side of a mob of leering mech boys standing over his sarcophagus. The Orcs completely destroyed the Tomb World. And we continue with the theme of the Necrons fighting another race as we get into Necrons versus Chaos. The Necrons are no strangers to fighting a psychically powerful enemy. As a matter of fact, they have the most experience fighting the forces of the Immaterium. As 60 million years ago, the Necrons waged a war in heaven against the Old Ones, an ancient race whose mastery over the Immaterium was so powerful that they created the Webway, a feat that no other intelligent species has been able to accomplish. And they also were able to biologically engineer psychically powerful warrior races like the Eldar and the Krork. Not having psychic powers themselves, the Necrons developed technologies with the help of the Catan that would manipulate the warp and its energies. Using black stone, which is a very rare substance that possesses the ability to not only nullify the psychic energies of the Immaterium, but also absorb them and then redirect the energy in explosive ways. They utilized this material to build planet-destroying weapons and defensive structures that helped them win the war in heaven. Now, one of the first arguments against the Necrons' battle with Chaos is that the Old Ones cannot be compared to the demons of the Immaterium. And it's somewhat true, as the turmoil and chaos caused by so many psychically powerful races in the current galaxy has empowered the forces of Chaos, and they are much more aggressive and stronger than the Old Ones ever were. But the Necrons have been in this situation before. They've been the underdog. They were completely outgunned and outmaneuvered during the war in heaven, but somehow they still managed to use their physics-bending technology to eventually cause the enemy to flee the galaxy. And the Necrons of today's time are preparing to do the exact same thing. The only difference is that they already possess this technology, it's just sitting there waiting. All across the galaxy, the Necrons left behind pylon structures similar to the pylons on Cadia that were holding back the Eye of Terror. These defensive structures are capable of creating tetrahedral regions of space that are completely immune to the immaterium. So while the forces of chaos have relied on summoning warp storms that allow the immaterium to bleed into real space and more of the legions of chaos to invade a planet, the black stone pylons of the Necrons have the ability to clear the warp storm away, taking away chaos's initiative. This is a counterattack used by the Necrons most recently in the Pariah Nexus, which shows how powerful the technology really is. Not only were the forces of chaos affected, but every psychically sensitive being was reduced to an empty shell, almost as if their soul was completely erased. So no matter how powerful the chaos demons are, it means nothing if they can't even get into real space. The major downside to this form of warfare is the logistics of the entire ordeal, because like I stated before, Blackstone is not readily available. Not only is it hard to find, but the other races like the Imperium of Man have begun to mine for this precious war material, meaning that the Necrons' war against Chaos will inevitably cause tension with the other major races, so Necron has to fight a war on multiple fronts. That and the dynasties have to use a lot of resources to reawaken and maintain the nullifying nexuses like the one we saw at the Pariah Nexus. The Necrons also seem to have the element of surprise on their side, because whenever these structures are discovered, the enemy doesn't seem to realize how powerful they truly are. It took Abaddon the Despoiler 13 attempts until he finally realized that he could simply destroy the pylons on Cadia and it would allow the warp portal to grow. 13 times. And it doesn't seem like this threat is shared amongst the Chaos forces, because after the destruction of Cadia and the birth of the Great Rift, warp storms erupted all over the Ultima Segmentum. One in particular unintentionally disrupted a Necron construct known as the Imga Monolith. After spreading across 3 star systems, the warp storm designated as Cerberus was stopped by a perfect sphere of order created by this ancient construct. It didn't take long before the forces of chaos bled out of the Immaterium and attempted to destroy the Necron monolith. Only the demons of Khorne, who presumably weren't affected by the psyker-canceling effects of the monolith, were able to assault the construct. This conflict became known as the Cerberus Wars, as the Necrons answered with the full military might of the Saltec Dynasty. Their warships formed a defensive shield around the monolith as it absorbed the psychic energies from the warp storm and somehow recycled that energy to physically duplicate any Necron warship that made contact with it. This obviously made the Necron force grow massive in size, and the two factions battled on every world within 1400 Terran sols of the monolith. Humanity was forced to join the fight as many of these planets were formerly controlled by the Imperium. Unfortunately, they began to enact exterminatus on the majority of the bordering planets. Now, how powerful the Necron force will become from this conflict is of great concern to the Imperium of Man, but it highlights how prepared the Necrons are in the battle against the forces of chaos. This is just one of many possible war constructs sitting and waiting to be rediscovered by the Necron dynasties. And it proves that these constructs do much more than just simply nullify the warp like the pylons on Cadia. This isn't to say that no Chaos Force could defeat a Necron Tomb World, as not all Tomb Worlds are built the same and they have access to different amounts of resources. A small Necron force on a Fringe World or even a Core World, for example, could get swept away by a demonic incursion, but the forces of Chaos would have a much harder time defeating a fully functional Crown World. Emphasis on the fully functional, because as I stated in the beginning of the video, a Necron world that only has its most basic defense protocols is just a sitting duck. Such was the case for the tomb world of Vorkath, when the demon prince Sokath Voidmaw invaded the planet, and by the time the Necron Lord was awakened, his entire legion had already been corrupted by chaos. This corruption could also happen to a fully functional Necron force, as the protocols of the basic Necron warriors can be controlled by any malicious scrap code, just like chaos corrupts the machines of the Omnissiah or the drones of the Tau Empire, but it's harder to enact such a wide-scale corruption when the cryptex of a tomb world would be awakened and operational, defending their tomb world. And it's fun to talk about the Necrons in a broad sense, but it is also important to focus in on the different dynasties. So let's do that as we focus into the Novak Dynasty. Before the Necron tier went through the biotransference process to become Necrons, the Novak Dynasty was infamous for its long and elaborate blood rituals, and for the naked savagery of its army. In this ancient past, the Necron tier empire was divided up into dynasties just like it is today, except in a smaller and more localized area of the galaxy. As the Empire grew, these dynasties became more and more independent as more of the Milky Way galaxy was conquered. This autonomy eroded the unity of the Necron tier, and internal wars between the different dynasties became common. This was known as the War of Secession. It was during this era of civil war that the Novak Dynasty developed its thirst for sacrificial blood rituals. It wasn't enough for the ruling pharaohs of the dynasty to simply engage in violent battles for victory. Their dominance and power had to be placed on display by capturing rival warriors and spilling their blood on the altars of their tomb complexes. Because of this, the architecture of what would become the dynasty's tomb worlds soon began to illustrate the Novak's fascination with bloodletting. Channels in which blood could flow from the victim's body all the way down to the tombs of the underworld decorated each building, and as the Novak's territory grew, so did their need to capture enemies. Eventually, wars were fought for the sole purpose of sacrifice, and these rituals became an integral part of the culture of the Novak. Seen as rites of passages and a mark of great honor, the knowledge of these acts spread throughout the other dynasties, and many Necron tier understood the bizarre role they would have to play if they were ever captured by the Novak. You see, much like the rest of the Necron tier empire, the Novak revered their dead, and the vast tombs that covered much of their domain were structures raised to honor these long-gone ancestors, and in the Novak's culture, the blood flowing down to the tombs of the ancients formed a sacred connection between the living and the dead. It was through the blood of the sacrifice that messages and petitions could be sent to the deceased. Each victim was forced to hear the people's prayers to the dead, and join in on the sacred songs and processions that praised the power of the Novak Dynasty. Once this part of the ceremony was over, the victim would be placed on an altar connected to the blood channels, and their body would be drained of blood in front of the entire city populace, who performed ritual dances and hymns. These strange and sadistic rituals continued even during the War in Heaven, where the blood of the Old Ones flowed through the Novak sacred cities. This would prove not just to their own race, but the entire galaxy that the power of the Novak was unbreakable. And since that ancient time, the Novak warriors are unrecognizable, and their blood rituals are a thing of the past. However, their legions retain their bloodthirst. Few Necron legions are as frightening to face in battle as those that come from this dynasty. It's one thing to witness flesh and blood warriors slash a path through their foes, but to see glassy-eyed androids move from methodical mechanical killing to ever more frenzied industrial slaughter is another scale of horror entirely. The Novak offer no quarters or no mercy to their victims. Instead, they hack them apart like lunatic butchers set loose on a pen of livestock. They do not stop killing until their living metal bodies are drenched in gore and their victims are nothing more than dismembered meat. And the reason for this gruesome spectacle is that the memories of the dynasty's blood rituals still linger in the personality engrams of the Novak Necrons. Though they can be ponderous right before a battle's commencement, once the enemy's blood starts flowing, the engrams are triggered. They provide Novak soldiery with surges of vigor and aggression that prove nearly narcotic. Taking full advantage of this trait, the Novak nobility field vast numbers of infantry assets headed by bands of blade-wielding Lich Guard. They are augmented, many would say recklessly, with those of their dynasties who have fallen to the Destroyer Curse. The Destroyer Curse seems to affect the warriors of the Novak Dynasty in greater numbers. The rage, anger, and despair of their soulless existence once awakened drives them into a killing frenzy. All they wish to do is hack apart the bodies and revel in the blood spilling. Referred to as the Heralds of Oblivion, the Novak Destroyers are feared by their fellow Necrons and can slaughter entire regiments in a matter of seconds. The Novak Dynasty has become experts at building campaigns around the actions of these destroyers. They acknowledge the pointlessness of enforcing battle plans on these twisted and enraged warriors. Such a force possesses numbers and resiliency, yet its true might is revealed once its bloodlust awakens and the butchery begins. Employing these tactics, the Novak Pharaoh, Galmak the Moonkiller, has driven his legions relentlessly outwards from the crown world of Dol 4 in one gory conquest after another. They have crushed greenskins and human alike, and show no signs of slowing. Now let's jump on over to another dynasty that's probably one of the most brutal and badass, the Nylak Dynasty. The Nylak Dynasty has garnered a fearsome reputation amongst the galaxy's younger races since their worlds began to awaken. At first, the warriors of the dynasty operated under a defensive protocol, believing that only their crown world was being attacked. This meant that all trespassers onto their sacred tomb world would be annihilated and any of their primitive infrastructure destroyed. As more and more of the dynasty began to rise from their great sleep, the Nylak discovered that much of their ancient territory had been invaded. Worthless species made out of weak flesh and blood had foolishly settled on their domain. This infestation of lesser beings was so bad that even the fringe worlds were being pillaged of whatever resources they had. Faced with very real danger of being overrun, their surviving nobility consolidated the dynasty's strength upon the newly reconquered crown world of Gendon. Luckily, the Nylak had always been a tremendously rich dynasty, and had funneled much of their vast resource wealth into the core world's hyperspatial vaults. Now they drew upon their horde to fashion legion upon legion of war engines, raise mighty defenses, and equip their warriors with the finest weaponry imaginable. There was even enough resources to send out legions of data-collecting scarabs that created the best possible extermination protocols for each unique threat. No fortress or citadel was left standing after each assault as the Nylak swept through their former domain, clearing out planet after planet. There were some worlds that put up a decent fight, but their fate had been sealed from the moment the dynasty crawled out of their tomb complex. After losing their claim on the Necron land, the lesser races hurled their armies against the newly fortified borders of the Nylak Dynasty, and they were rebuffed with devastating casualties. To the arrogant Nylak Dynasty, every race that attempted to counterattack or recapture their land was to be made an example of. The warriors of the dynasty would not rest until the perceived impotence of the attackers had been ruthlessly punished with utter annihilation. The well-appointed Nylak legions had another advantage in their war for survival. Greatest of the dynasty's cosmic treasures was the preserved head of the Yitzir, the last of its race, and a means by which the Necrons could peer into the skins of the future. Armed with such a prescient intelligence, the Nylak struck precisely where and when they needed to in order to crush any interlopers, transforming their defensive stance into a more offensive march of conquest. Now the Nylak legions are on the march, seizing and heavily fortifying new territories with Noctilith pylons before advancing again. They have openly aligned themselves with the return of the Silent King and seek nothing short of galactic dominance for their people. And that is the 2021 Necron recap. I hope you guys enjoyed. Like I said, this isn't the only Necron lore that we talked about throughout the year. We did have the Silent King come out, so we talked about the Silent King quite a bit. But I hope you guys enjoyed. More lore videos to come. Smash the like button if you like this kind of like longer format. I might be able to try to focus more on longer stories. But yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed, and we'll talk tomorrow. This is Garsh1 with One Mind Syndicate, signing out.
Always used to put my freedom first in any situation.